A millionaire demanded that a 78-year-old man be kicked out of the restaurant because he smelled like garbage. But she was shocked when she found out who he really was. The Grand Lux restaurant, located in one of New York's most prestigious hotels, was the elite's favorite destination. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling, casting a soft glow over elegantly set tables, while the sound of discreet conversations and delicately handled cutlery filled the air. The atmosphere was one of refinement and exclusivity, where every detail, from the fresh flowers on the tables to the impeccable service, contributed to the feeling of being in a place reserved only for the privileged. Constance Miller, a 50-year-old woman known for her regal bearing and imposing presence, entered the restaurant with the confidence of someone used to being treated like royalty. Wearing a navy blue silk dress and discreetly sparkling jewelry, Constance walked to her usual table, where a waiter was already waiting to help her settle in. She sat down, elegantly arranging the napkin on her lap, ready to enjoy another evening of luxury and indulgence. However, as Constance reviewed the menu, something unexpected happened. A foul odor, something that did not fit the refined ambiance of the restaurant, reached her. She frowned, trying to identify the source of the disturbing smell. Her eyes scanned the room until they stopped at a figure seated a few tables away. Ernest Brown, an elderly man of humble appearance, wore simple time-worn clothes. His wrinkled features and calloused hands told stories of a life dedicated to hard work. He sat alone, clearly out of place in that luxurious setting, but with a calm and dignified expression. Constance's discomfort quickly turned to indignation. She called the restaurant manager, a middle-aged man who quickly responded to her summons, noting the seriousness in her gaze. "This is unacceptable," Constance said in a low but authoritative voice. "What is this man doing here? The smell from that table is unbearable. Something needs to be done immediately." The manager, visibly unsettled, tried to calm Constance. "Mrs. Miller, I apologize for any inconvenience. I will check the situation." He approached Ernest, who greeted him with a calm look, without any hint of malice. The manager, in a polite but firm tone, explained that there had been complaints and that he would need to ask him to leave the restaurant. Ernest, understanding what was happening, gave a slight, sad smile. "I don't want to cause trouble," he said softly but firmly. "If my presence is bothersome, I can leave." Constance watched the scene from a distance, with barely concealed satisfaction. For her, the problem was about to be solved, and her evening could finally proceed without further disturbances. However, something in the way Ernest rose, erect and unhurried, deeply unsettled her. He kept his head held high, his steps were firm, and his gaze remained serene, as if he were above that humiliation. The restaurant, which until then had been filled with murmurs and low conversations, fell into an uncomfortable silence as Ernest walked past the tables towards the exit. Several patrons watched silently, some clearly uncomfortable with what had just happened, but no one dared to speak a word. When Ernest left the restaurant, the manager returned to Constance, trying to assure her that the incident was resolved. "I hope you can enjoy your meal now," he said in a conciliatory tone. Constance nodded but did not respond immediately. Although the man who had bothered her was gone, there was something she couldn't ignore. The dignity with which Ernest had accepted being expelled disturbed her in a way she couldn't understand. For a moment, she wondered who that man was and what he was doing there, but she soon dismissed these thoughts, turning her attention back to the menu in front of her. As the waiter approached to take her order, Constance regained her usual composure. After all, she was Constance Miller, a woman who controlled her environment and did not allow anything or anyone to interfere with her carefully orchestrated life. The day after the incident at the restaurant was like any other for Constance Miller. She woke up early, had her breakfast in her luxurious penthouse, and prepared for the various meetings that filled her schedule. As usual, her life followed a meticulously organized rhythm, with no room for unforeseen events. However, that night, an unforeseen event was about to occur. Valerie, her daughter, had invited Matthew Brown, her boyfriend, for a family dinner. Valerie was a free-spirited and kind-hearted young woman, very different from her mother. She worked as an architect at a reputable firm in New York and was deeply in love with Matthew, a dedicated civil engineer she had met on a collaborative project. Constance, although she had accepted Valerie's relationship with Matthew, always had reservations about the young man's humble origins. However, out of respect for her daughter and husband, Alexander, She kept her opinions to herself, hoping the romance was just a passing phase. The dinner was prepared with great care, and Constance had ensured that the table was perfect. Everything seemed in order when Valerie and Matthew arrived, accompanied by none other than Ernest Brown, Matthew's father. Constance, seeing him at her doorstep, felt a chill run down her spine. She immediately recognized the man who had been expelled from the restaurant the previous night. Her heart raced, and for a brief moment, she considered canceling the dinner right then and there. But her pride and desire to maintain appearances prevented her. Valerie, unaware of the previous night's events, cheerfully introduced Matthew and his father to Constance and Alexander. "Mom, Dad, this is Matthew, my boyfriend, and this is his father, Ernest. I thought it would be a great opportunity for you to get to know each other better." Alexander, ever the diplomat, extended his hand to greet Ernest with a warm smile. "A welcome to our home, Mr. Brown. It's a pleasure to meet you." Ernest, in turn, shook Alexander's hand firmly and replied politely, "The pleasure is mine, Mr. Miller. Thank you for the invitation." Constance, however, remained silent, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Her mind was in turmoil, trying to process the bewildering coincidence of meeting Ernest again under such different circumstances. Not wanting to be rude in front of Valerie, she merely nodded, without uttering a word. The dinner began, and although the food was impeccable, the atmosphere was charged with palpable tension. Constance avoided looking directly at Ernest, while Alexander tried to keep the conversation flowing with superficial topics. Valerie, sensing the tense atmosphere, tried to lighten the mood by talking about her work and her future plans with Matthew. That's when the conversation took an unexpected turn. Alexander, perhaps attempting to break the ice, asked Ernest about his work. "So, Mr. Brown, I've heard you have a long history as a farmer. That must have been both hard work and rewarding at the same time." Ernest nodded and replied with the same calm demeanor he had shown the night before. "Yes, it was hard work, but I've always been proud of what I did. Building something with my own hands and seeing the fruits of that labor is something I've always valued. Although I've stepped away from the fields in recent years, I still support what I can, especially when it comes to rural infrastructure." These words caught Alexander's attention. "Rural infrastructure, you say? Interesting, because years ago I was involved in a similar project with a partner. It was a project to build bridges and roads to improve access for farming communities." Ernest looked directly at Alexander, and recognition flashed in his eyes. "That partner was you, Alexander." The silence that followed was heavy. Constance, who had been struggling to maintain her composure, felt her heart sink. She knew that this dinner had taken a turn she couldn't control. Alexander, surprised and somewhat confused, blinked a few times before responding. "Ernest, you were my partner. How did I not realize it before? It's been so long. I thought that project had been forgotten." Ernest remained calm. "For you, maybe it was forgotten, Alexander, but for me, it was a great loss. Not just of the project, but of the friendship we had." Valerie and Matthew exchanged worried glances. This wasn't what they had envisioned for the dinner. Valerie, wanting to ease the situation, intervened. "Maybe this is an opportunity to reminisce about old times and perhaps even think about new projects together." Constance, feeling that she was losing control of the situation, finally spoke, but her voice was cold and calculated. "It seems everyone has a lot of history to share. Perhaps another time we can discuss it in more detail. For now, how about we enjoy dessert?" The dinner continued, but the tension lingered. Constance felt increasingly uncomfortable, unable to accept the irony of having humiliated a man who now appeared to be so significant to her husband and her daughter's future. The night came to an end, and after the guests said their goodbyes, Constance was left alone in the dining room, reflecting on what had happened. She knew this wouldn't be the last time Ernest Brown would cross her path, and something told her that next time, the consequences could be much deeper. The morning after the dinner began in the usual way for Constance Miller. She followed her morning routine, but couldn't shake the thoughts that had tormented her throughout the night. The memories of the dinner kept invading her mind, especially the discomfort she felt upon discovering the connection between her husband Alexander and Ernest Brown. Constance was not the type of person who liked surprises, particularly those that challenged her sense of control and superiority. As Constance prepared for another day of meetings and commitments, Alexander was in his office, lost in thought. He couldn't stop thinking about the unexpected reunion with Ernest. Years had passed since he abandoned the rural infrastructure project, and the guilt for leaving his former partner behind began to weigh on his conscience. Alexander clearly remembered the days when he and Ernest worked together. The project was ambitious: to build bridges and roads that would connect isolated farming communities to the rest of the country. At the time, Alexander was determined to make a real difference in people's lives. But the financial opportunities in the city, combined with Constance's pressures to climb the social ladder, pulled him away from his ideals. He had left Ernest behind, assuming the project was a lost cause. Now, sitting in his leather chair, Alexander leafed through old files. He found documents related to the rural infrastructure project he had started with Ernest. As he reviewed them, nostalgia mixed with guilt. He remembered Ernest's enthusiasm, the dedication, and commitment he had to the project's success. Alexander realized that by abandoning Ernest, he not only betrayed a friend but also his own principles. Valerie, on the other hand, was worried about her parents' reaction after the dinner. She knew that something had changed in the family dynamic and feared that her relationship with Matthew might be harmed by the tensions between her parents and his father. Valerie had always valued honesty and respect, and the idea that her family might be at odds with the values she cherished deeply troubled her. She decided to visit Alexander in his office to talk about what had happened. As she entered, she found her father deep in thought, staring at the documents in front of him. "Dad," Valerie began, her voice calm but concerned, "can we talk about last night's dinner? I noticed there was some tension between you and Mr. Brown. What really happened between you two?" Alexander sighed, knowing he could no longer avoid the subject. He looked at his daughter, realizing she deserved to know the truth. "Valerie, there was a time when Ernest and I were very close. He was more than a business partner, he was a friend. We were committed to a project that could have changed many people's lives, but I abandoned it. Back then, your mother and I were focused on other things, on climbing the social ladder, securing a place in society. And I left Ernest behind." Valerie was silent for a moment, absorbing her father's words. "You never told me about this," she said, trying to understand why he had kept this secret for so long. "I guess I was trying to forget," Alexander admitted, running a hand through his hair. "It was a selfish decision. And seeing Ernest last night, and it brought everything back. He never openly blamed me, but I know I deeply disappointed him." Valerie sensed the sincerity in her father's words and felt a mixture of sadness and empathy. She knew her father was a man of principles, but she also knew he had made difficult choices in his life. "So what are you going to do now?" she asked, a hint of hope in her voice. Alexander looked at the documents on his desk and then back at Valerie. "I don't know, sweetheart. But I think I need to make things right, somehow. I can't keep ignoring what I did, or the impact it had on Ernest's life." Meanwhile, Constance was fighting her own internal battle. The memory of Ernest being thrown out of the restaurant, and now knowing his significance in Alexander's past, began to eat away at her self-confidence. She had always believed that money and social standing were the true measures of worth, but now that belief was being challenged. Ernest, a man she had once looked down upon, carried a dignity that deeply unsettled her. She decided she would confront Alexander later that day. "Alexander, we need to talk about this Ernest Brown," she said bluntly as soon as she found him in the living room. Alexander, still lost in his thoughts, nodded. "Yes, Constance, we do. But first, I think you need to understand what really happened between us." Constance crossed her arms, her face maintaining its usual cold expression. "What exactly do I need to understand, Alexander? That you walked away from a project that might have been a waste of time?" Alexander shook his head, tired of how Constance reduced everything to financial success. "It's not about that, Constance. It's about values, friendship, doing the right thing. Ernest trusted me and I let him down. And now, I feel like I have an obligation to try and make things right." Constance, sensing the seriousness in her husband's words, fell silent. For the first time, she began to question whether her worldview, centered on status and wealth, was starting to crumble. In the days following the revelation about his past with Ernest Brown, Alexander couldn't shake the feeling that he needed to correct his mistakes. The guilt he felt for abandoning the project and his friendship with Ernest weighed heavier than ever. Every time he looked at the old documents in his office, the memory of the betrayal he had committed resurfaced, and the need for redemption grew more urgent. Valerie, noticing her father's dilemma, encouraged him to reach out to Ernest. Dad, I know it won't be easy, but I think you need to talk to Mr. Brown. If there's anything you can do to fix what happened, now's the time." Alexander knew his daughter was right. He spent hours reviewing the original proposals for the rural infrastructure project, analyzing how he and Ernest had planned to connect remote farming communities with bridges and roads, significantly improving their lives. Now, he was determined to see the project through, even if it meant facing his past and dealing with the consequences of his actions. One afternoon, Alexander decided he couldn't put off the conversation any longer. He picked up the phone and dialed Ernest's number, which Valerie had gotten for him. After a few rings, a calm and familiar voice answered. "Ernest, this is Alexander Miller," he began, trying to keep his voice steady. I'd like to talk to you if possible. I know it's been a long time, but I think there are things we need to discuss." There was a brief silence on the other end, and Alexander braced himself for the possibility of rejection. But then, Ernest responded, his voice filled with surprise, but also a certain expectation. "Of course, Alexander. I think it's about time we had this conversation. Can we meet at the farm tomorrow?" Alexander accepted the invitation with gratitude, feeling a weight lifted from his shoulders. The next day, he drove out to Ernest's farm, located on the outskirts of New York. The drive was an opportunity to reflect on everything that had happened and what he would say to Ernest. Memories of the time when they were partners flooded back, blending nostalgia with regret. When he arrived at the farm, Alexander was greeted by a serene and well-kept landscape. Ernest's farm was modest, but it radiated a sense of peace and hard work. He parked the car and stepped out, feeling the solid ground beneath his feet, a stark contrast to the luxurious marble floors he was used to walking on. Ernest was waiting for him on the porch, hands in the pockets of his worn jeans. His face, marked by time and life's hardships, showed an expression of tranquility. Alexander walked up the steps, and for a moment, the two men just looked at each other, as if trying to measure the distance created by time and past mistakes. "Ernest," Alexander began, extending his hand, "thank you for agreeing to see me." Ernest shook Alexander's hand, a firm grip that conveyed respect, but also a certain caution. "It's good to see you, Alexander. Let's sit and talk." The two of them sat down in rocking chairs on the porch, looking out at the vast expanse of the farm ahead. For a moment, only the sound of the wind and the birds filled the silence between them. "Ernest," Alexander said, breaking the silence, "I don't know how to begin to express how sorry I am for what happened. I walked away from our project, I walked away from our friendship, and I followed a path that, looking back, I realize wasn't the right one. I know words can't undo what happened, but I'm here to try and make things right." Ernest listened in silence, his eyes fixed on the horizon. When Alexander finished, he finally spoke, his voice calm but firm. "Alexander, I won't lie to you. It was hard when you left. I believed in that project, and it wasn't just about the infrastructure. It was about what we could do for the people, for the communities that needed those roads and bridges. When you left, I kept going for a while, but without the financial support and the expertise you brought, I couldn't move forward." Alexander felt a lump in his throat. He knew Ernest was right. He had let a dream die because of his personal ambition and the desire to please Constance. "I want to make it right, Ernest. I want us to pick up the project again. I have the resources now, and with your knowledge, we can make this happen." Ernest looked at Alexander, weighing his words. There was a sincerity there that he hadn't seen in Alexander for a long time. "If we're going to do this, Alexander, it has to be for the right reasons. I'm not interested in profits or status. I'm interested in helping people, as I always have been." Alexander nodded vigorously. "I agree, Ernest. I want to do this the right way, for a greater purpose." Ernest remained silent for another moment before giving a slight smile. "Then maybe we can make this work." The decision was made there, on that porch, surrounded by the sounds of nature and the weight of the past. The two men stood up and shook hands again, a gesture that sealed not just a business agreement, but also the rebirth of a long-lost friendship. As Alexander walked back to his car, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. He knew this was just the first step on a long and difficult path, but he was determined to move forward and make a difference, this time for the right reasons. With the decision to restart the rural infrastructure project firmly established, Alexander and Ernest began to lay out the first steps to rebuild the venture that meant so much to both of them. Alexander returned to New York with a new perspective, determined to gather the necessary resources and to do things differently this time. He and Ernest kept in constant contact, discussing plans and reviewing old documents to ensure the project's viability. However, as things began to progress, a shadow from the past was about to reappear. A few weeks later, Alexander was in his office, reviewing proposals from potential business partners who could fund the project. He was focused, determined not to make the same mistakes as before. That's when his phone rang. "Alexander Miller speaking," he answered, distracted. "Alexander, it's been a while," said a familiar voice on the other end of the line, carrying an arrogance that made Alexander's stomach churn. "I bet you didn't expect to hear from me again." Alexander immediately recognized the voice of Charles Dawson, the third partner in the old infrastructure project. Charles had been one of those responsible for the collapse of the original venture, betraying Alexander and Ernest's trust by selling confidential information to a competitor for immediate profit. It was a name Alexander had hoped never to hear again. "Charles," Alexander replied, keeping his voice controlled, though his mind was on high alert. "What do you want?" "I heard that you and Ernest are restarting that old project," said Charles, his voice dripping with insinuation. I was curious how you plan to do that without the help of a real strategist like me." Alexander felt anger boiling inside him. Charles had always been a manipulator, someone who put his own interests above everything and everyone. "We're doing just fine, Charles, and we don't need your help." "Come on, Alexander," Charles continued, unfazed by Alexander's cold tone. "You know as well as I do that this project has potential, but it also comes with a lot of risks. I'm the person who can help minimize those risks. Besides, I have some information that might be useful." "Information?" Alexander asked, suspicious. "What kind of information?" "Oh, nothing you don't already know, but from a slightly different perspective. Let's just say I've been watching some movements in the market, and I can assure you there are people interested in seeing this project fail, just like before." The suggestion that Charles had information that could sabotage the project made Alexander uneasy. He didn't want to do business with Charles again, but he knew that ignoring him might be a mistake. "Why are you doing this, Charles?" Alexander asked, trying to understand the motivations behind the sudden reappearance. "You've already betrayed us once. Why should we trust you now?" Charles laughed, a sound that made Alexander's nerves even tenser. Maybe I have my own reasons, Alexander. Or maybe I've learned some lessons over the years. Either way, I'm willing to talk. But that, of course, is up to you." Alexander didn't want to get involved with Charles, but the insinuation that there were forces working against the project worried him. He knew he needed to discuss this with Ernest before making any decisions. "And I'll think about it, Charles," Alexander replied, keeping the conversation brief. "But don't expect anything right away." "Don't worry, Alexander," Charles said, his voice still full of confidence. "But I'm sure you'll make the right choice." After hanging up the phone, Alexander remained silent for a few minutes, reflecting on the call. He knew he needed to speak with Ernest as soon as possible. Charles was dangerous, and any involvement with him could jeopardize not only the project but also the renewed friendship between Alexander and Ernest. Later that same day, Alexander took a trip to Ernest's farm to discuss the situation. When he arrived, he found Ernest working in the field, as usual. Alexander quickly explained what had happened, and Ernest listened attentively, his expression remaining calm but with a slight hint of concern. "I knew Charles might resurface," Ernest finally said. "He's never been the type to let opportunities slip by. But Alexander, we need to be very careful. He's already betrayed us once, and we can't let that happen again." "I know, Ernest," Alexander replied. But he suggested there are other people interested in sabotaging the project. If that's true, we need to be prepared. Ernest was silent for a moment, considering the situation. Maybe we should hear what he has to say, he cautiously suggested. But without any commitments, We need to know where we stand. Alexander agreed, albeit reluctantly. He knew bringing Charles back into the circle was risky, but he also knew that ignoring a possible threat could be even more dangerous. Let's set up a meeting with him, Alexander finally decided. But we'll do it on our terms. And above all, we need to make sure he doesn't have any more tricks up his sleeve. As they made preparations for the meeting with Charles, both knew that this decision could determine the success or failure of the project. And once again, the past was coming back to haunt their present. The meeting with Charles Dawson was scheduled for a cloudy afternoon at a discreet cafe in downtown New York. Alexander and Ernest arrived together, ready to face the man who had caused so much damage in their lives years ago. Though both were determined not to let Charles manipulate the situation again, the tension was palpable. When Charles walked into the cafe, his presence immediately brought a change in the atmosphere. He was dressed elegantly, as usual, but there was something calculated in his expression, something that made Alexander and Ernest even more alert. Charles greeted them with a smile that didn't reach his eyes and sat down at the table, ordering a black coffee. "And good to see you both again," he began without any hesitation. "Looks like we're all a bit older, but still have the same good taste for business, don't we?" Alexander didn't respond to Charles's comment. Instead, he got straight to the point. "And we're here because you said you had important information about our project. So, what do you know, Charles?" Charles looked from Alexander to Ernest, then leaned forward slightly, as if about to share a secret. "I know you're picking up the rural infrastructure project again, and I also know there are people interested in seeing it fail, just like before. Some of your old competitors are keeping an eye on what you're doing and have already started moving to make things difficult." Ernest, who had been silent until that moment, finally spoke, his voice calm but firm. "Why should we believe you, Charles? You betrayed us once. What makes you think we're willing to trust you now?" Charles sighed, as if preparing for a response he knew wouldn't be well received. "You have every right not to trust me, and I don't expect you to. But what I'm saying is true. The same interests that sabotaged the project in the past are at play again. If you ignore this, the project might fail once more." Alexander and Ernest exchanged glances. The prospect of facing the same challenges that had destroyed the original project was daunting, but ignoring Charles's words also seemed like a reckless risk. "If this is true, why are you telling us now?" Alexander asked. "What do you get out of this, Charles?" Charles shrugged. Maybe I've learned from my mistakes. Maybe I'm trying to make things right. Or maybe I see this as an opportunity for all of us to win. I'm not here to screw you over again, Alexander. I'm here to offer help. I can provide information and strategies to deal with these interests. Of course, I'm not doing this for free, but I think we can come to an agreement." Ernest, who had maintained a reserved posture until now, looked at Charles with a critical eye. "And what's the price of your help?" Charles smiled. "Nothing more than a small percentage of the project's profits. After all, if we're going to face these sharks together, it would only be fair for me to have my share too." Charles's proposal put Alexander and Ernest in a dilemma. On one hand, Charles's words carried weight, and the threat of sabotage was real. On the other hand, allowing Charles to get involved again posed a risk that both knew could be dangerous. Alexander took a deep breath, aware that the decision they made could determine the future of the project. "We'll need some time to consider your proposal, Charles. This isn't something we can decide here and now." Charles nodded, seemingly accepting the response calmly. "I understand. Take the time you need, but don't take too long. Time is something you don't have in abundance on this project." After the meeting, Alexander and Ernest left the cafe in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. The tension between them was evident, but there was also a tacit understanding that, regardless of the decision they made, they would need to be prepared for the consequences. Later, in Alexander's office, the two men sat down to discuss what to do. "And I hate the idea of relying on Charles again," Alexander said, clearly frustrated. "But we can't ignore what he said. If there are people interested in sabotaging the project, we need to be ready." Ernest nodded slowly. "But if we're going to work with Charles, we need to set clear rules. He can't have control over anything. We need to keep the project in our hands." Alexander agreed. "And we also need to protect what we're doing. We'll ramp up the security of the documents and operations. We can't give anyone the chance to bring us down again." They decided they would accept Charles's offer, but only on their terms. Ernest and Alexander were determined not to repeat the mistakes of the past. They knew the road ahead would be tough, but they were prepared to fight for what they believed in, no matter the cost. With this decision made, the next steps would be crucial. They would need to work together to ensure the project moved forward, overcoming any obstacles that arose. And above all, they would need to stay alert for any signs of betrayal, for they knew that when it came to Charles Dawson, distrust was always the best defense. With the decision made to allow Charles Dawson to get involved in the project, though with strict precautions, Alexander and Ernest began working to bolster their defenses. They ramped up the security of the documents and operations and decided to hold regular meetings to closely monitor the project's progress and any signs of trouble. Despite the precautions, a sense of distrust permeated the atmosphere. Charles was back in the circle, but neither Alexander nor Ernest let their guard down. They knew he was a cunning man, always looking for an advantage, and they weren't willing to be caught off guard again. A few weeks passed, and the rural infrastructure project began gaining momentum. Negotiations with financial partners were progressing, and plans for the construction of the first roads and bridges were underway. However, tensions among those involved also began to rise. During one of the meetings held in Alexander's office, Charles brought up a delicate issue. "I have an important update," he said, with a tone that suggested the news wouldn't be pleasant. "I've received information that one of the competing companies is planning to launch a project similar to ours. They have enough political and financial backing to outdo us if we don't act quickly." Alexander frowned, concerned about the new information. "Who are they, and how did they gain access to these resources?" Charles gave a sarcastic smile. "This is what I've been trying to warn you about. We're not just dealing with a competitive market. We're dealing with powerful interests who have no qualms about using every possible tactic to bring us down. And before you ask, I don't have concrete proof, but I have good sources who assured me that this is more than just a rumor." Ernest Iger, who had remained silent up until now, observing the dynamic between Charles and Alexander, decided to intervene. "And what are you suggesting, Charles? That we abandon the project again? Or that we play the same dirty game these competitors are playing?" Charles raised his hands in a conciliatory gesture. "None of that. What I'm suggesting is that we need to be smarter. If we want this project to move forward, we're going to need allies and a strategy that anticipates these competitors' moves. I'm talking about forming strategic alliances, maybe even with some of these politicians. I know it's a complicated path, but it's what we need to do if we want to stand a chance." Alexander felt a growing discomfort. Charles's proposal went against his principles, but he also knew that in the business world, especially with projects of this magnitude, things were rarely black and white. "I'm not comfortable with the idea of partnering with corrupt politicians or using unethical tactics," he said firmly. "This project was designed to help rural communities, and I don't want to deviate from that goal." Charles shrugged, unfazed. "And I understand your position, Alexander, but the real world doesn't work that way. If you want results, you need to play the game. Otherwise, you might as well give up now and let those competitors take what's rightfully ours." The room fell silent, each person pondering Charles's words. Ernest, however, seemed deeply troubled. He rose from his chair and looked directly at Charles. "You may be right about the challenges we face, but I won't compromise my values to win. If this project moves forward, it will be for the right reasons, not through manipulation by corrupt forces." Charles stared at Ernest with a calculated look. "You're an honorable man, Ernest, and I respect that. But integrity doesn't build bridges or roads. We need to be pragmatic." Ernest didn't back down. "Pragmatism doesn't mean abandoning our principles. If we do that, we're already defeated before we even start." Sensing the tension rising, Alexander decided to wrap up the discussion. "And we need to find a middle ground. We can't be naive, but we also can't lose sight of what truly matters. Let's explore our options while keeping our principles intact." Charles nodded, seemingly accepting the decision, but there was a glint in his eyes that suggested he still had cards to play. "As you wish, but remember, time is against us. We need to act quickly." As the meeting drew to a close, Alexander and Ernest left with conflicting emotions. They knew the road ahead was fraught with obstacles, and that Charles could be both a valuable ally and a potential threat. But above all, they knew they would need to stay united to succeed. Later that night, as he reflected on the meeting, Alexander was surprised by a call from Valerie. "Dad, can we talk? I'm worried about everything that's happening with the project. Matthew told me that you and Mr. Brown are facing a lot of challenges." Alexander sighed, feeling the weight of his responsibilities. "It's true, Valerie. We're dealing with problems I didn't anticipate, and things are getting complicated." Valerie hesitated for a moment before continuing. "Dad, I know you're doing the best you can, but I want you to remember why you decided to take on this project. Don't let the circumstances force you into something you'll regret later." Valerie's words touched Alexander deeply. He knew his daughter was right. No matter how tough the situation became, he needed to stay focused on what was important, helping the communities that needed the project and doing so in an ethical and honorable way. With renewed conviction, Alexander prepared for what lay ahead, determined to face the challenges without compromising his values. He knew the next confrontation would be crucial, both for the project's future and for his own sense of integrity. The days following the meeting were filled with a mix of uncertainties and preparations. Alexander and Ernest knew they were racing against time and forces that could easily crush their efforts. The decision to move forward with the project while keeping their principles intact hadn't been easy, but it was the only choice they could accept. However, Charles continued to push for a more pragmatic approach, causing constant friction among the three. Alexander and Ernest were determined to maintain control over the project, but Charles, with his insistence on exploiting dubious alliances, began to sow discord. On a chilly autumn morning, Alexander called Ernest for a meeting in his office. It was a private meeting, without Charles's presence, as Alexander needed to discuss a plan without the old partner's interference. Ernest arrived punctually and was greeted by Alexander with a serious expression. "Ernest, we need to talk about how we're going to handle Charles," Alexander began bluntly. "I feel like he's trying to manipulate us, and it's making me increasingly uncomfortable." Ernest nodded, having anticipated this inevitable conversation. "I feel the same way, Alexander. Charles has always been skilled at exploiting others' weaknesses, and I don't think he's changed. We need to be cautious." Alexander stood up from his chair and began pacing the room, as he often did when worried. "We need a plan, something that allows us to continue the project without Charles's influence, but also protects us from the external threats he mentioned." Ernest pondered for a moment before responding. "If we're going to do this, we need reliable allies. People who share our values and are committed to the project's success for the right reasons. We can think of strategic partners who have influence and can help us neutralize threats without compromising our integrity." Alexander stopped pacing and looked at Ernest, surprised by the simplicity and wisdom of his suggestion. "We can seek investors or organizations with a legitimate interest in seeing the project succeed. Maybe we can even get government support, as long as it's done transparently. We need to act fast," Ernest continued. "If we wait too long, Charles may find a way to dig deeper into the project, and then it will be much harder to remove him." With a plan in mind, Alexander and Ernest began drafting a list of potential allies. They decided to seek support from non-governmental organizations focused on rural development, as well as to talk to politicians with a track record of integrity and commitment to social causes. They knew it would be a tough task, but they also knew they were doing the right thing. In the days that followed, Alexander and Ernest worked tirelessly to reach out to these potential allies. Some meetings were scheduled, and soon they began receiving positive responses from people and organizations genuinely interested in the project. However, as Alexander and Ernest strengthened their alliances, Charles began to realize he was being sidelined. He arranged a meeting with Alexander and, while noticing that his suggestions were being ignored, decided to confront him. "Alexander, I see you're making decisions without consulting me," said Charles, his voice a mix of frustration and barely restrained anger. "I thought we agreed to work together on this project." Alexander, knowing this confrontation was inevitable, stayed calm. "Charles, what we're doing is protecting the project. You suggested alliances and tactics that go against everything Ernest and I stand for. We need reliable allies, not deals with questionable people and practices." Charles laughed, a sound that made Alexander realize just how different their worldviews were. "You've always been naive, Alexander. The world isn't that simple. You think you can win by playing fair? Good luck with that. Ernest, who had remained silent until then, stepped in. Charles, you're right about one thing. The world is complicated. But that doesn't mean we have to compromise. What we're trying to do here isn't just about building bridges and roads. We're trying to build something bigger, something that will have a real positive impact, and we're not going to do that by sacrificing our values. Charles looked at the two men with a mix of disdain and resignation. He knew he had lost the battle for control of the project, but there was still a glint in his eyes that suggested he wasn't entirely defeated. Very well, he said, his tone carrying a veiled threat. But remember, the world isn't kind to idealists, and when things fall apart, don't say I didn't warn you. With that, Charles stood up and left the room, leaving Alexander and Ernest alone. Both men knew that even though they had managed to push Charles away, the danger hadn't passed. His words hung in the air like a warning, but at the same time, there was a sense of relief for having made a decision that, though risky, was in line with their principles. As they watched Charles leave the building, Alexander and Ernest knew that the real test was yet to come. They were about to enter the most challenging phase of the project, where their alliances would be tested, and where they would have to fight to ensure that their dream of improving so many lives didn't turn into yet another tragedy. The atmosphere in New York grew increasingly tense as the rural infrastructure project progressed. Alexander and Ernest were in the middle of a storm, not just figuratively, but literally as well. The weather seemed to reflect the growing tensions as the winds blew stronger and dark clouds gathered on the horizon. Inside their offices, however, preparations continued, with endless meetings, delicate negotiations, and mounting pressure to deliver results. The alliances that Alexander and Ernest had formed began to show signs of success. Several NGOs and respected political figures offered their support to the project, drawn by the promise of a lasting positive impact. It seemed that the strategy of distancing themselves from Charles and his questionable methods was starting to pay off. However, the road ahead was far from safe. On a particularly gloomy afternoon, Alexander received an urgent call from one of the project's strategic partners. It was one of the NGOs they had established an important partnership with. "Us, Alexander, we need to talk immediately," said the voice on the other end, filled with concern. "We've received information that some of your competitors are making strange moves. It seems they're trying to buy our influence to pull us away from the project." Alexander felt his stomach turn. He knew Charles had mentioned the possibility of sabotage, but he hadn't expected it to happen so soon and so aggressively. "Who's behind this?" he asked, trying to stay calm. "We're not absolutely sure, but our contacts suggest it could be an alliance of several companies that have an interest in controlling the development of these rural areas. They see your project as a threat to their profits." Alexander thanked them for the information and hung up the phone, feeling the pressure mounting even more. He needed to act quickly to protect the project and the alliances they had formed. Immediately, he reached out to Ernest to discuss the situation. When Ernest arrived at the office, the atmosphere was already tense. The office windows rattled with the strong wind outside, and the impending storm seemed to reflect both men's state of mind. "I got a call today," Alexander began, cutting straight to the point. "They're trying to buy off our partners to pull them away from the project. It looks like things are escalating faster than we expected." Ernest frowned, clearly concerned. We need to protect our allies, Alexander. If they start doubting the success of the project or our ability to deliver, they might give in to the pressure and back out." "We need a strategy," Alexander continued. "Something that shows we're in control, that we have the resources and the determination to move forward, despite the threats." Ernest thought for a moment, watching the storm intensify outside. "Or maybe it's time to show some concrete results. We need to move forward with the first phase of the project. Start building one of the bridges. That'll show we're not just planning, but actually executing." Alexander nodded, recognizing the wisdom in Ernest's suggestion. "And that will also give us more positive visibility. If the public sees the project underway, it'll be harder for our competitors to sabotage us without facing consequences." They decided that the next step would be a public announcement, followed by the immediate start of construction on one of the project's most important bridges. It was a risky move, but necessary to reassure their partners and the public that the project was moving forward. As they prepared for the announcement, however, unexpected news arrived. Valerie Han, who had been following the project's progress and the tensions involved, went to her father's office with a worried look. "Oh, Dad, I just found out that Charles Dawson was seen meeting with some of the leaders of the companies you mentioned. It looks like he's involved with the competitors and might be orchestrating this sabotage attempt." The revelation shocked Alexander, but at the same time, it wasn't completely unexpected. Charles had always been an ambitious man, and now it seemed clear that he was playing both sides. Ernest, who was present for the conversation, clenched his fists, feeling his anger rise. "So, he's been planning this from the beginning. He was just waiting for the right moment to stab us in the back." Alexander felt a mix of frustration and determination. "We can't let him beat us. We need to move forward with the announcement and the construction. The sooner we start, the less time he'll have to undermine our efforts." With that decision made, they moved forward with the preparations. The public announcement was made, highlighting the positive impact the project would have on rural communities and how it was an essential initiative for the country's development. The news was well received, and the construction of the first bridge began within days. The storm outside was raging, but inside the hearts of Alexander and Ernest, there was a renewed sense of purpose. They knew the next few weeks would be critical, and that the true test of their determination and integrity was yet to come. Charles Dawson had made his move, and now it was up to them to respond with strength and conviction, keeping their focus on what really mattered, transforming the lives of thousands for the better. The construction of the first bridge was progressing rapidly. Alexander and Ernest were pleased with the progress, and the project's public visibility was increasing by the day. News about the initiative gained media attention, with reports praising the benefits for rural communities and the determination of the leaders to face challenges. However, the shadow of Charles Dawson still loomed over the project. Valerie, who was becoming more involved in the project and closely monitoring developments, decided to dig deeper into Charles's actions. She knew her father and Ernest were busy with construction and negotiations with partners, but she felt someone needed to keep an eye on Charles's moves. With Matthew's help, who was also concerned about the situation, Valerie began gathering information on Charles's meetings with competitors. During this investigation, Valerie and Matthew made a startling discovery. They found documents indicating that Charles was secretly involved in a plan to sabotage the bridge's construction. He had provided insider information about the project to competitors, who were planning to use this advantage to delay construction and undermine the trust of partners and the public. Armed with this information, Valerie rushed to her father's office, where Alexander and Ernest were discussing the next steps in the construction. She entered hastily, interrupting the meeting. "Oh, Dad, I need to talk to you right now," Valerie said, her voice laced with urgency. Alexander, recognizing the seriousness of his daughter's tone, immediately halted the discussion and turned his attention to her. "What happened, Valerie?" Valerie took a deep breath before beginning to explain what she had discovered. "Matthew and I found evidence that Charles is working with our competitors to sabotage the project. He's leaking information about the bridge's construction, and they're planning to delay everything, which could destroy our credibility." Ernest, who had been listening silently until then, frowned, feeling a wave of anger rising within him. "I knew Charles couldn't be trusted, but this is outright betrayal." Alexander remained silent for a moment, processing the information. He knew Charles was dangerous, but the extent of his betrayal was greater than he had imagined. "We need to act immediately. If Charles is really involved in this, we need to expose him and stop his plans from moving forward." Ernest agreed. "We need to confront him with this evidence. If we can publicly expose him, he'll lose any influence he still has, and our competitors will think twice before going through with their plan." They decided then that they would confront Charles directly. They arranged a meeting, pretending it was just another discussion about the project's progress. Charles, always alert, suspected nothing and attended the meeting at Alexander's office. When Charles entered, he was met with serious looks from Alexander, Ernest, and Valerie. He immediately sensed that something was wrong, but he kept his expression neutral. "Charles, we have something to discuss," Alexander began, in a tone that made it clear this was not a routine conversation. We've received information indicating that you're involved in a plan to sabotage our project. We have proof that you've been leaking confidential data to our competitors." Charles remained calm, but a slight glimmer of concern showed in his eyes. "And that's a serious accusation, Alexander. Do you really think I would do something like that?" Valerie, who had so far left the confrontation to her father and Ernest, decided to step in. "We know you're lying, Charles. We found documents proving your involvement. You're working with our competitors to destroy everything we're trying to build." For a moment, Charles hesitated, realizing the situation was turning against him. But then, as a last-ditch effort, he tried to turn the tables in his favor. "And if you have evidence, then show it. But know that I'm not the only one involved. If I go down, others will go down with me." Charles's threat was met with disdain by Alexander. "We're not interested in your blackmail, Charles. If you think you can intimidate us, you're very mistaken. We're going to expose what you've done and make sure you never have the chance to harm anyone again." Charles realized he was cornered. He knew any attempt to deny the accusations would be futile. With one last look of contempt, he stood up from the chair. "You may destroy me, but you won't be able to take down everyone who's against you. Good luck with that." With those words, he left the office, leaving behind a trail of uncertainty, but also determination. Alexander, Ernest, and Valerie knew they had done the right thing in exposing Charles, but they also knew there was still much work to be done. After Charles's departure, they immediately reached out to their contacts in the media and among their partners to expose the conspiracy. The news spread quickly, and the competitors, realizing they were at risk of being associated with a scandal, backed off. Charles, for his part, lost all his credibility and influence, becoming a pariah in the business world. Despite having overcome yet another obstacle, Alexander and Ernest knew the real test was still to come. The construction needed to be completed, and all eyes were on them. Any mistake now could mean the end of everything they had worked for. But as the storm outside began to dissipate, there was a sense that the worst was over. With Charles out of the way and the competitors temporarily sidelined, Alexander and Ernest felt they could finally move forward with the project without the shadows of the past haunting them. Now, all that remained was to focus on the future and ensure that, this time, they got everything right. With Charles Dawson finally out of the way and the conspiracy exposed, Alexander and Ernest felt a great weight had been lifted. However, they knew there was still much work to be done. The bridge construction continued, and with the media and public's attention on the project, the margin for error was minimal. The next few days were intense but also rewarding. The bridge, symbolizing the rebirth of a decades-old dream, began to take shape before everyone's eyes. Alexander and Ernest were on site every day, closely monitoring each step and ensuring everything was going according to plan. Their presence, shoulder to shoulder with the workers, was a testament to their commitment to the project. During this time, the bond between Alexander and Ernest grew even stronger. What had begun as a partnership in a shared dream decades ago was now transforming into a deep and restored friendship, built on the foundations of trust, respect, and a common goal. Valerie and Matthew also played crucial roles, assisting with communication with partners and keeping morale high among everyone involved. Valerie, in particular, felt immense satisfaction seeing the project move forward, knowing she had helped protect something that meant so much to her father and Ernest. However, despite all the progress, there was an underlying sense that the final challenge was still ahead. The bridge construction was in its final stages, and with the end in sight, expectations were high. The completion of the project would be the culmination of all the hard work, but it also represented the moment of greatest vulnerability. Any failure in the final phase could unravel everything. Finally, the big day arrived. The bridge was ready to be inaugurated, and a ceremony was organized to mark the occasion. Political figures, community leaders, NGO representatives, and the media were all present to witness the historic moment. Alexander, Ernest, Valerie, and Matthew were at the forefront, ready to cut the ribbon and usher in a new era for the rural communities that would benefit from the infrastructure. The ceremony was filled with emotion. Alexander and Ernest gave heartfelt speeches, thanking everyone who had contributed to the project and highlighting the importance of collective effort and perseverance. They also didn't shy away from mentioning the challenges they had faced along the way, including Charles's betrayal and the resistance from powerful competitors. "This project is not just about a bridge," Alexander said in his speech. "It's about what we can achieve when we put our values first and come together for a greater purpose. This bridge is a symbol of hope, of redemption, and of the fact that together we can make a difference." Ernest, in his turn, spoke with the simplicity and wisdom that had always been his trademark. "This bridge represents what we've always believed, that no one should be left behind, that with determination and integrity, we can overcome any obstacle, and that, above all, what we do here will have an impact for generations to come." When the time came to cut the ribbon, Alexander and Ernest held the scissors together, symbolizing the union of their efforts and the closing of a cycle that had begun so many years ago. With the ribbon cut, the bridge was officially inaugurated, and a loud applause echoed through the site. However, as the ceremony unfolded, Valerie noticed a familiar figure in the distance, watching everything from afar. It was Charles Dawson. He stood alone, without the arrogance that had always accompanied him. Instead, there was an expression of resignation and perhaps even regret. Valerie decided to approach him, driven by a curiosity that mixed empathy and caution. When she got closer, Charles looked at her, not trying to justify or explain his presence. "Came to see the bridge, Charles?" Valerie asked, her voice soft but firm. Charles gave a slight, humorless smile. "I guess I wanted to see what I missed out on," he replied, with an honesty that surprised Valerie. "I spent so much time trying to play the game, trying to win at any cost, that I forgot what really mattered. And now, here I am, on the outside, watching you accomplish something I could have been a part of." Valerie remained silent for a moment, absorbing Charles's words. She knew that, despite everything, there was truth in those words. Charles had allowed himself to be consumed by his own ambitions, and as a result, he missed the opportunity to do something meaningful. "And is it too late to change things?" Charles asked, more to himself than to Valerie. Valerie took a deep breath before responding. "It's never too late to change, Charles. But choices have consequences, and sometimes you have to accept what you've lost. What matters is what you do from now on." Charles nodded, visibly moved. He knew the bridge symbolized more than he could express at that moment. It was a lesson in what could have been, but also a reminder that, no matter how much he had erred, there was still time to find a new direction. "Good luck, Valerie," he finally said, before turning and walking away, disappearing into the crowd. Valerie watched as Charles left, feeling a mix of sadness and relief. He was no longer a threat, but a man who had lost his way. As she returned to her father and Ernest's side, she felt a deep gratitude for where they were and for having overcome all the challenges together. As the bridge was crossed by the first trucks loaded with supplies for the rural communities, Alexander, Ernest, Valerie, and Matthew stood side by side, watching the fruits of their labor. They knew this was only the beginning of something bigger, and that the legacy they had created would continue to grow, benefiting future generations.